Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, well, good evening to everyone, those of you who have joined us. At the very beginning, I would like to start off this session on a rather personal note because Nishorko has been my student. In fact, he has been one of the most brilliant students of the Department of English of Surendranath Evening College. I remember him being a very, very active student of our department. I used to be there, of course, along with Shobhikda and Devopriyoda, and Aruti, of course. We were a very close knit team. So I thank Nishargo for giving me this opportunity for talking on a subject which is very close to my heart. I also must put out my thanks to my supervisor, Dr. Nilanjan Chatterjee, who was very helpful in giving me the inputs on this subject. In fact, I must say that I was encouraged to read African literature and study African literature as such by none other than Professor Chandrani Biswas of St. Xavier's College. She was the one who encouraged me to take up this area, and I therefore worked on it in my research and PhD and stuff like that. So I'm not going, so let's not go in too much into that. So Africa and African post-colonialism. So this is basically what I plan to do in this lecture. I will not bore you. It will not be a very long kind of a thing because then I can understand it in an online platform. It's very difficult for us to keep our patients for a long period of time. The research suggests that our concentration is waning after 7 minutes. So obviously, I will keep it short, and try it. So African post-colonialism. Now, this is something that I'm going to do in my talk. I'm not going to give you a whole lot of details, but I'm going to mainly concentrate on the peculiarities of African experience in the post-colonial space, and I will be mainly concentrating on three post-colonial writers and thinkers, as it were. I would be concentrating on Fanon, then Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, and of course Chinua Achebe. There are many, many others. I must give this disclaimer that African post-colonialism requires a great deal of, you know, a great a great deal of research, a great deal of thinking. But so let us focus on these three authors for the time being. Yeah. So right. So the thing is that um, so to begin with, uh, let us discuss the very paraphernalias of post-colonialism as such. We know that post-colonialism is something which became very popular in the academia with the decolonization of the African and the Asian nations, mainly from the 1940s onwards. So it is indeed a debatable fact. It is a debatable thing as to how can we define post-colonialism, right? So post-colonialism seems to be centered around five key elements. First of all, of course, is the genealogy of it, right? So the genealogy, of course, would talk about the historical origins of post-colonialism as a theoretical construct. The boundaries of it, that is, how can we locate post-colonialism in the larger literary and cultural space? Where is it located physically? Where is it located in Europe? Is it located outside Europe? What so that is something that we need to sort of look at. Then of course location, fields. Fields means the discursive fields, right? Um, the various narratives with which post-colonialism works with. Then, of course, location. Yeah, just a thing. The host is muting me. Just keep a tab on that. Um, Okay, so the locations. Now, the locations of post-colonialism is very important, right? The propositions of locations and how we can locate post-colonialism in the larger academic circle, and of course, very importantly, the ideologies, and the ideological constructs with which post-colonialism works with. Right. So, well, let me say that. Um, I think post-colonialism. Can I just mute all of your microphones, please, because there's a sound coming over here. Okay. So the thing that I want to start off with is the fact that you see post-colonialism has a very interesting location to it, because look at the term post-colonialism, right? So there is a post in over there, right? So when we talk about post-colonialism, many of the critics would tell you, many of the critics would actually, would tell you that post-colonialism is something that comes after colonialism, right? So therefore, it is an ideological space, it is a theoretical construct, it is a language which is coming after colonialism because it is post-colonialism. But there, of course, are others who would argue that no, post colonialism is a constant ideological proposition. It is a constant ideological struggle that seeks to counter colonialism. Right, so it is a constant ideological proposition. So there are, of course, these very many debates about it. Now, please understand this, that there post-colonialism as a debate, post-colonialism as an academic or ideological narrative, is something which is getting it's food, as it were, from the rise of colonialism, right? um, so colonialism as a construct, as a political, economic, and cultural construct, seek to put Europe at the center. We all know this, right? So therefore, colonialists would try and make us believe that Europe is at the center of the consciousness. They are the ones who are on a quote unquote civilizing mission, right? And so therefore the colonialists are therefore moving out of Europe, and they are, of course, first of all setting up their setting up their economic transactions with these colonies, and then, of course, from economic colonization they move on to the political colonization, right? So that's how the things moved. So post-colonialism, I would say, is something which is an ideologically inclined narrative. Post-colonialism is ideologically inclined a narrative which is trying to resist the onslaught of colonialism and the tendency of colonialism and the politics of colonialism to put Europe at the center. Europe is put at the center in very different ways, in terms of its political construct, in terms of its racial superiority, in terms of its culture, in terms of its learning, in terms of its quote unquote humanism and stuff like that. So, therefore, this politics of putting Europe at the center is something which is deeply problematized, questioned, interrogated, and resisted by post-colonialism. Post-colonialism, is questioning this very value, this very ideological and political standpoint of Europe to put itself at the center. Okay, there is a wonderful book that you must read in this context. It's by David Mignolo, Mignolo. Mignolo is writing a book called The Darker Side of Renaissance. The Darker Side of Renaissance, where Mignolo is arguing that Europe is putting itself at the center from the Renaissance onwards, because remember that Renaissance is basically the time when Europe is navigating out, okay, and moving into Africa, the Indian subcontinent, America, later on into Australia. So therefore, that is the time when Europe is moving out, And so the book is of course called The Darker Side of Renaissance, and it's by Mignolo, Mignolo. And therefore this is something which is that this is something that Mignolo is arguing. Now Mignolo's argument is very interesting. That is where let us start our argument, as it were. So Mignolo is arguing that Europe is constructing certain symbols through which it is justifying its act of centering itself, right? So what are those symbols? Of course, the most prominent symbol is perhaps the skin color, the whiteness of the Europeans. Now we know that whiteness of the Europeans and the blackness of the Africans, or the brownness of the Indians, has got nothing to do with being superior or being inferior. It is just because it is because of a certain geographical location. And we know that the skin color of yours is determined by is determined by is of course determined by the percentage of some pigment in our skin, and that percentage is determined by the amount of sunlight that falls on our body. So these are the scientific things that are there. But Europe is putting itself at the center because it wants to construct whiteness as a symbol of cultural supremacy, as a symbol of human supremacy. Very interesting. So therefore, the white and the black are immediately binarized. So the white is at the center, the black is at the margins. Language. So the European languages become the symbols of enlightenment. So if you know English, you are a big shot. And if you are talking in Bengali, then it's not that good. These things are still, yes, anybody? No. Okay, so these things are still there. By the way, I'll talk about neocolonialism later on. So therefore, Mignolo's argument is that he's actually drawing. Please mute your microphones. Thank you. So Mignolo is drawing upon the concept of space by Lefebvre. Lefebvre. Lefebvre, I think, is writing a book called The Production of Space. I'm not very sure about the title, but this is something like that. So Lefebvre, Lefebvre, Lefebvre is talking about the production of space, how spaces are constructed epistemologically. That is, how spaces are constructed through language. So the colonial writers are, or let's say yes, exactly, Henry Lefebvre is the production of space. So Lefebvre, of course, is talking about the way in which language constructs space. So the colonial writers, the colonial thinkers, the colonial intellectuals, the colonial politicians, they're all producing the space of colonialism through these symbols. And these are the symbols. And by the way, religion is also a very important symbol. We know that the British and the Europeans came with a Bible in one hand and the gun on the other hand. So therefore, religion becomes a site of contestation, a site of forcing the colonial ideology onto the colonized space. So therefore, these are the different ways in which Europe is constructing itself as the center. Now, when the African that we all know this, right? That the Africans had to deal with a very, very violent very, very violent political reality of being enslaved, right? We all know about the cross-Atlantic trade and the way in which the Africans were literally chained and moved across the Atlantic, and they were made to work in the sugar plantations in America, right? We all know about those. Of course, in this context, please read a book by the book is called The Black Atlantic. Okay, The Black Atlantic. So please read that. I have so just look up to your search engines for the author. So The Black Atlantic talks about that. I'm not going into all that, but so after this, when you have the post-colonial writers coming in Africa, what they're basically doing is they are resisting this very centering of Europe, right? Now, this is nothing different, as it were, to the other post-colonial experiences across the globe. So every post-colonial author, right from America, yes, by Paul Gilroy, as Nisharka points out. So therefore, the post-colonial, authors in India, in America, later on to an extent, even though post-colonialism in America is a very problematic space. I'm not going to maybe that for another day. Then of course the Latin Americans, they're all talking about, they're all resisting and interrogating and questioning this politics of the centering of Europe. Now the Africans, you know now where do the post-colonial authors or post-colonial thinkers differ? I think, to me, the post-colonial authors differ at a point when they're talking about the unique experience of their colonialism. So colonialism as an experience is not the same everywhere. As a colonized subject, the Indians will have a different experiential plane as compared to the experiences of the Africans, or for that matter, the Australian natives. They would experience the brunt of colonialism in a different way. The Latin Americans in a different way. The Native Americans in a different way. So that is where the post-colonial authors actually differ. How they sort of talk about their unique experiences of negotiating with colonialism. Now, so first of all, let me come to a very potent question, and that is where we are going to sort of concentrate on the individual authors, as it were, as I promised you. So first of all, let us talk about a bit about Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o. Now, Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o is a very important Kenyan author and a Kenyan post-colonial thinker. Now, Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o's most important book, of course, is Decolonizing the Mind, which is very, very interesting, a title, Decolonizing the Mind. Now, so Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o is of the point of view, this is how he sort of begins his argument. Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o says that this entire politics, this entire process of decolonization is a far more, is far more problematic. It is more nuanced than just driving out the British. All right. So he's talking about the decolonization of the mind. Look at the title, Decolonization of the Mind. So how we can sort of decolonize ourselves in our minds. Now, Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o argues that colonization, has different parts to it. One, of course, is the economic colonization. The economics people will take care of that. The political colonization, the political science people will take care of that. But we, who are the cultural readers, as it were, we read culture, we are the ones who are more interested in the process of cultural colonization. Now, cultural colonization involves the cultural appropriation of the colonized space. That is how the culture of the colonized space is taken over by the colonizer, right? So the thing is that when the British are coming to Africa, what they're doing is they are appropriating the African culture. Okay, they're appropriating the culture, the African culture. They're taking over the African culture, and they are imposing European culture onto the Africans. One of the key elements by which they do that is through the introduction of English. Now, Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, says that he attended a particular seminar which is called which is called a Conference of African Writers of English Expression. This conference was held in the Makerere University of Uganda in the year 1962. You will get all the details in the book. This is the same conference, that is a Conference of African Writers of English Expression. This same conference was also attended by Chinua Achebe, and Chinua Achebe also refers to this conference in some of his essays. Now, I would especially like you to register the title of the seminar. The title of the seminar is A Conference of African Writers, okay, we understand till that, of English Expression. Now, if you remember from your MA days, I'm sure you would have done an Indian novel called Kantapura by Raja Rao, where in the preface, Raja Rao was talking about constructing a certain Indian English. So in this particular book, what Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o is basically proposing is that English needs to be first of all decolonized. Now, this is a very, very problematic question, and this is a question that every post-colonial author has to negotiate with. Why do you have to write in English? Right? It's just it's something which is it's a very basic question. Why do we have to write in English? Because English is not our language. Okay, English is something which is which is of course the colonizers' language. So therefore, why do we have to write in English? Now, this is a very, very extremely a basic question, but a very difficult question to answer. Very, very difficult question to answer. Um, we must remember that this is something that we will have to register, that the post-colonial authors suffer from what we call a kind of a double consciousness. Please remember this, that when these post-colonial intellectuals like Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o or Chinua Achebe for that matter, or in our country, people like Aurobindo and Vivekananda and Rabindranath to Bankim Chandra, to everyone, they're all exposed to Western education. In fact, that is the education that they get because they are a part of a social elite. Now, Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o himself went to a Catholic school, right, giving instructions in English. So he did not go to a school where he was being taught in his native language. His native language, by the way, is Gikuyu, 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 which is again a native language in Kenya. Well, no, they're not. They're not getting education in their native language. They're actually getting educated in the Western language. And because they're getting education in the Western language, they are being exposed to the Western ideologies, right? They're reading Shakespeare. They're reading, the political philosophers from Europe, right? Now, this is the way, remember, this is the politics of Europe to create a certain class of bourgeois who will be exposed to the Western education, because that helps the bourgeois to become close to the British, right? So if I am exposed to Western ideas, if I am exposed to Western territories and Western education, then naturally I will be more attracted to the Western world, because that is what I know. I'm also, of course, reading Western history. So therefore, the point is that that is the space with which I am comfortable with. That is the space that I know. And therefore, as a part of the bourgeois class, I am getting closer to the British. All right? Because that is all what I know. I do not know about Africa. I do not know about my own language. I do not know about my own history. I do not know about my own territory. I do not know about my own geography. And so therefore, what is happening is that the identity of the colonized people is being constructed in a rather problematic manner. So therefore, you are being located in your own space, but then you are uprooted from there, and your mind is now located in Europe. So therefore, this is how the colonization of the mind takes place. This is the colonization of the mind that Thiong'o is talking about decolonizing. He's talking about the decolonization of the mind. So therefore, this is the question that everybody's asking. Now, for example, Chinua Achebe. I just want to read out this quote. Now, Chinua Achebe, as I told you, is also attending the same conference. In fact, there is this personal anecdote where Ngũgĩ Thiong'o says that he wanted to meet Chinua Achebe very badly because by 1964, Chinua Achebe had already published a couple of his novels, which were immensely popular, and so therefore he was an established name in the world of academia, in the world of creative literature, and so therefore he wanted to present some of his own novels to Achebe so that his novels get published. And that's the personal story behind this conference. But what is Chinua Achebe writing? Now look at this. Chinua Achebe writes an essay called "The African Writer and the English Language." The African Writer and the English Language. Now, in that particular essay, Achebe writes, and I'm quoting, "Is it right that a man should abandon his mother tongue for someone else's? It looks like a dreadful betrayal and produces a guilty feeling, but for me, there is no other choice. I have been given the language and I intend to use it." All right. So therefore, this is what I was talking about. That Chinua Achebe is saying this, that these post-colonial authors have really no option but to use English, because that is the language that they have been taught in the schools. So therefore, there is no way in which they can write in their native tongue, because they do not have that flair, they do not have that experience to write in their native tongue. Okay, so that is something which is very, very important. So therefore, Chinua Achebe is proposing something. Chinua Achebe proposes that they have to appropriate the language and sort of decolonize English from England, if I may say it in this way, right? So therefore, Chinua Achebe is saying that we have to decolonize English from England so that English becomes a language in which the peculiar and the particular experiences of African colonialism and post-colonialism can be constructed. Right? So this is something which is so very important. So I love this, when Ngũgĩ Thiong'o says that in the classrooms, what we were basically subjected to was a psychological violence. I really, really love this, because with this, you can connect to the concept of the ideological state apparatus by the Marxist critic Althusser, right? Althusser is talking about the ideological state apparatus, the ideologies which produces identities, right? So this is the ideology of colonialism, which is producing the identity of the Africans. So this is a kind of a psychological violence that Chinua Achebe is talking about. So therefore, he says that yes, it is indeed true that Gikuyu is the native language in which Thiong'o is talking. It is his native language, but then that native language is something which is simply cannot write in, because they simply do not have that experience, as it were. So therefore, Thiong'o says that there are three aspects to language. He says that there are three aspects to language. One is, of course, that language is an expression of the real life. Now, this is something that Ngũgĩ Thiong'o is, of course, drawing from Karl Marx. And Marx had said that people enter into relations with each other through the power of language. So therefore, that is one of the functions of language. The second language, of course, is the part in which it is imitating the language of real life. So the languages of literature imitates the languages of real life. The third one is most important, where Ngũgĩ Thiong'o says that the third part of language, of course, is the aspect of the written signs. That is how language becomes a written codification through which history of a race is expressed. Now, in this particular aspect, um, that is language as written signs, this is where Ngũgĩ Thiong'o notes that colonialism produced these signs through which Europe was put at the center. In this context, let me also talk a little bit about an essay that you must read. I don't know whether you already have, but if you haven't, please do that. It's written by Chinua Achebe, and it is a criticism of Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness. Now, in that particular essay where Chinua Achebe is critiquing, as it were, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, there Chinua Achebe says that, Conrad is producing Africa through language. Okay? Conrad is producing Africa through language. And what kind of language is Conrad using? Conrad is using a deeply colonial language to depict Africa. So there are so many different signs and symbols through which Conrad is stereotypifying Africa. Africa is, if you look at that particular scene, and this is what Chinua Achebe is pointing out as well. If you look at a particular scene from the novel, you will see that, Marlowe is moving closer towards Africa. So this is like, from the macroscopic space is moving to the microscopic space. There he sees some of the Africans who are seen as black, naked creatures. So Africans are basically dehumanized. They're not given any individual identity, but they're simply they're simply being they're simply portrayed as black people. So therefore what Achebe is arguing is, and of course in the portrayal of Kurds and the way Kurds is seen as a person who is appropriated by the atavistic darkness of Africa, and very dangerously becomes a cannibal. This kind of representation of Africa, according to Achebe, is of course racist. Please connect this with Ngũgĩ Thiong'o's proposition that language is produced through written signs. Mignolo is also talking about the written signs through which the Renaissance Europe was kind of othering Africa. So Conrad is also othering Africa. In our UG syllabus these days, we have Tintin, right? If you read a particular comic book, it's called Tintin in Congo, I believe. Now, in Tintin in Congo, if you look at the representation of the African people, you will see that they're basically wearing leaves, and they're cannibals because they want to eat up Tintin. And there, if you look at the pictorial representation, because pictorial representation is very important in comics. So if you look at the pictorial representation of the people of Congo, you will see that they're basically painted by Hajj as apes. Tintin looks like a human being because he is from Europe, because he represents the European civilized world. But the African people are not only black, which is fine. There's nothing wrong in being black. But the point is that they are simply painted as apes. Many of the anthropologists who came in the 18th centuries and the 19th centuries, people like Malinowski and the others, they were working from that Eurocentric point of view as well. And so therefore these anthropologists also felt that the first humans came out of Africa, which is a wonderful thing. But they felt that because the first humans came out of Africa, so therefore Africa is still caught up in that dark world of uncivilization, right? So there's a deep stress in Europe's representation of Africa, and of course, putting Africa into a state of lack of civilization, right? So we have talked a bit about Ngũgĩ Thiong'o. Let me now come to a bit on Chinua Achebe, and last I'll go on to Fanon. Don't worry, I'll not take much of time from here on. So Chinua Achebe. Now Chinua Achebe, as we know, well, he has many novels to his credit, right? Right from Things Fall Apart to No Longer It Is, to Arrow of God, to Antils of Savannah, and so on and so forth. Chinua Achebe, I really have a personal fascination for him because Chinua Achebe has a very nuanced take on colonialism. Now, we have already referred to that particular point where Chinua Achebe is talking about the fact that he has to use English because that is the language that he knows, that is the linguistic tool that he has to represent himself. But Chinua Achebe, in one of his essays, tells us that our past is not a technicolor idyll. This is a quotation that I really remember from my PhD days. That Chinua Achebe writes that our past is not a technicolor idyll, which is very interesting because Achebe has a very I would say nuanced take on colonialism because he is the one uh, who is talking about the internal structures of violence which are inherent within the native society. If you look at the novel Things Fall Apart, you will see that yes, the colonizers are definitely coming with a mission to enslave and colonize the Africans. Yes, the Igbo people. That is one part of the story. But the other part of the story is that Achebe is also talking about the inherent structures of violence which are there within the Igbo society, which sort of which asks for sacrifice of people. Ikemefuna is a character in the novel who has to be killed because apparently the gods want a sacrifice. So there are many instances of such things, where we see these internal structures of violence inherent within the within the Igbo society. But of course, I'm not going into his creative literature as such. But let me come to his critical thing, because that's what we are basically dealing with tonight, which is of course African post-colonialism, the theoretical aspects of it. So I want to refer to a particular essay. Now, this is a book that you must read. It's called Morning Yet on Creation Day. Morning Yet on Creation Day. This is by Chinua Achebe, and this actually constitutes a collection of essays, an anthology of essays. Right now, in this particular, just a second. Yeah. So in this particular book that Chinua Achebe have that Chinua Achebe is writing. Now in this, we have a particular essay called colonialist criticism. Now in colonialist criticism, what Chinua Achebe is referring to is a particular critic called Honor Tracy. Now Tracy, Tracy, Achebe is jokingly referring to as a kind of a small time critic. But Honor Tracy is saying that Honor Tracy kind of gives a criticism of Chinua Achebe's novel Things Fall Apart. Now, in that criticism, Honor Tracy writes, "The African is indeed my brother, but my junior brother." Okay, so therefore you can understand the politics of the Europeans. Now, this is exactly what, as a post-colonial author, Chinua Achebe is trying to resist. He's trying to resist that. So he refers to many essayists, who are writing from Europe. But Chinua Achebe's contention is this: that the problem with most of the European critics talking about Africa is that they do not know much about the African experience. In fact, the European critics are basically looking at African representations from the perspective of colonialist discourse. So when a European is looking at Africa, he is still looking at Africa as a rather as a rather dark space. So therefore, that is something which is very, very problematic according to Chinua Achebe. So therefore, he says that this is exactly what the African authors need to resist. They need to talk against these tendencies to stereotype Africa, of course. So here, what Chinua Achebe is doing is exactly this: is talking about the way in which Africa is stereotyped. Now, um, in another essay by Chinua Achebe called "Africa and Her Writers," which is there in Morning Yet on Creation Day, um, he is saying that um, what the Africans need to do is Africans need to talk about their cultural spaces. That is, an African writer writing in English should not write about, should not write about European experiences or should not write about European philosophies and ideologies, but he should appropriate the language in such a manner so that the language becomes a tool to express the African experience. Um, here, you know, here, of course, let me just, just allow me to quote Chinua Achebe. So Chinua Achebe is writing in Africa and Her Writers. Let me give one example from Nigeria. Among the Oweri Igbo there was a colorful symbol ceremony called Mabari, a profound affirmation of a people's belief in the indivisibility of art and society. Mabari was performed at the behest of the earth goddess Allah, the most powerful deity in the Igbo pantheon, for she was not only the owner of the soil, but also controller of morality and of creativity, artistic and biological. Every so many years, Allah would instruct the community through her priest to prepare a festival of images in her honor. The night that night, the priest would travel through the town, knocking on many doors to announce to the various households who of the members Allah had chosen for the great work. So, what Achebe is basically trying to say is that the African post-colonial writers should follow a particular politics. The politics is to connect society with art. In fact, Achebe says that the post-colonial African authors cannot follow the ideology of art for art's sake. All right. In fact, even in the 20th century, as we know that in the European modernism, there is a tendency to objectively look at society and critique it. This is what T.S. Eliot is doing. Virginia Woolf is doing. They're looking at society from a rather individual point of view. Individualization of art is something which is very typical of the avant-gardist literature and art of the European modernism. Now, this is something that Chinua Achebe is resisting. Chinua Achebe is saying that the politics of the African post-colonials should be that that the African post-colonial writers should deeply interconnect their art with society, because that is what has been happening in Africa for centuries. Which of course is represented by this wonderful festival of Mabari, where the priest would sort of choose people who would draw pictures or who would write poems about their society. So therefore, this is something which is ancestral to the African experience, and so therefore it is very important that it is. So therefore, it is very important for the Africans, to sort of interconnect their art with society. This is something that that of course Chinua Achebe is doing. So Chinua Achebe is of the point of view that the English that the English language should be appropriated in such a manner that they become a very important part of the African experience. So Africa, you know that Chinua Achebe is, of course, is of course a novelist, mainly a novelist, even though he is also a poet. But these are the things that is saying, basically the way in which these things are doing. But another thing that I must point out to you is this: that Chinua Achebe, while talking about the African experience and stuff like that, Chinua Achebe is also saying that history is a very important part. It's a very important part of a post-colonial author's politics, because remember that history is something which is produced by the colonizer, right, which is produced through power. So therefore this is something which has to be countered. So this is the counter to power, right? So African writers must talk about their own history, their own culture, through whatever means they feel best. And they have to do this in order to construct and create that African experience. Right. So the last, the last topic that we are coming to is, of course, um, Frantz Fanon, very, very important author. And the name of his book, as we all know, is The Wretched of the Earth. Now, very interestingly, in The Wretched of the Earth, the preface to The Wretched of the Earth is written by Jean-Paul Sartre, right? The same Sartre that we all know about. Now, I'm not going to the preface as much because that will require a lot of discussions. But again, in this particular book, Frantz Fanon is talking about the process of decolonization. Now, let me just read out a sentence what Frantz Fanon is writing. So Frantz Fanon is saying, decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. So, it's very, very interesting that, Frantz Fanon says that decolonization is in a state of disorder, because he believes that decolonization is something which is a rather complex process. It just cannot happen like that. But um, well, what Frantz Fanon is arguing is that colonization produced a very important thing. What did it produce? Colonization produced a capitalist society in the colonized countries, right? Now it produced a capitalist society. This is what Frantz Fanon's argument is, that colonization produced a very capitalist society in the colonial spaces. Why? Because the colonial experience is such, the colonial politics is such that the European colonizers would would enter into trade relationships with their colonized countries, and they would sort of extract most of the wealth out of those colonized countries, and they would feed that wealth into their own economic system. We all know about the famous lectures of Shashi Tharoor, right? And please listen to his lectures and the way in which Dr. Tharoor is arguing that how most of the industrial revolution's wealth was actually kind of extracted out of India, especially extracted out of Bengal. In fact, 70% of the industrial revolution's wealth came from Bengal, and so therefore, please blame Bengal's lack of wealth, as it were, if I may say in that way. Because of this history. So therefore, this is the way in which a capitalist, extraction, in which a capitalist exploitation is produced by the colonial countries. But the thing is that when the decolonization is happening, he says that in the process of decolonization, what happens is that in most of the post-colonial societies, decolonization becomes an incomplete act, because remember that when the colonial countries, or when the colonizer is entering into this trade relationship with their colonized countries, they're entering into these trade relationships, they're entering into these economic relationships with mainly the bourgeois of those colonized countries. Now this bourgeois class remains in the colonized country even after the colonizer moves out politically, right? Now this bourgeois class is the new class that exploits the lower classes, right? The labor classes. So therefore, and Frantz Fanon's contention is that even after the political decolonization happens, the economic decolonization does not quite happen because the bourgeois class is still thriving on a system which sort of which exploits the labor of the common people. So this is something which he feels is very, very important in a post-colonial society. um, so liberation is not complete. Now let me read out what Frantz Fanon is writing. Fanon says, but it so happens, but it so happens sometimes that decolonization occurs in areas which have not been sufficiently shaken by the struggle for liberation, and there may be found those some same know-all smart willy intellectuals. We find intact in them the manners and forms of thought picked up during their association with the colonialist bourgeois. Spoiled children of yesterday's colonialism and of today's national governments, they organize the loot of whatever national resources exist. Without pity, they use today's national distress as a means of getting on through scheming and legal robbery by import-export combines, limited liability companies gambling on the stock exchange, or unfair promotion. We hear so much about crony capitalism these days, right? So Frantz Fanon is talking about this crony capitalism, this unholy nexus between the capitalist class and the political bourgeois of a post-colonial society. Now, what happens is that because of this, rampant corruption creeps in, and because of this corruption, there is a system which sort of keeps on exploiting the common people, and the common people do not even realize that they are being exploited in the name of national governance, right? Uh, well, I do not want to give too much of contemporary reference because it's not very intelligent to do that these days. But it is indeed, this is, I think, an experience which we can sort of identify with. So this national life, which Frantz Fanon is talking about, he calls this a kind of a Manichaeanism. No, is a kind of a Manichaeanism. That is, it is a mechanism through which the colonial society is gripping, or the post-colonial society is sort of negotiating with the structures of oppression and exploitation, which still carries on in the post-colonial space. Now, that is something which is very, very, unfortunate, according to Frantz Fanon. Now, in a particular essay from the same book, it's called, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness. Now, I'll just move into another essay. Pitfalls of National Consciousness is good, but there is another book. There's another chapter by him, of course, which is called On National Culture. In National Culture, uh, he writes, I'm just quoting, and then I'm sort of moving into a more nuanced discussion about it. So, in this particular chapter on national culture, Frantz Fanon is noting, by a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it. This work of devaluing pre-colonial history takes on a dialectical significance today. Of course, we know that Frantz Fanon is a Marxist, so he's obviously talking about the dialectical materialism. But what is so important is that what he's talking about is the fact that in the what the post-colonial writers are doing is, post-colonial politicians, writers, thinkers, intellectuals, what they're doing is they are still not decolonized in their mind, like what Ngũgĩ Thiong'o was writing about. So, we are still not decolonized in our mind. So if we are not decolonized in our mind, And if we are still not out of that system of colonial oppression, then how is it that this violence will stop? So this violence of oppression, this violence of this structural violence, it's a structural violence. It's not a violence which is very palpable, but it is a structural violence. It is a structure in place where the bourgeois class, the political class, are still continuing with the colonial politics of oppressing the labor. Now that is again a post-colonial tension, a post-colonial stress which the post-colonial society will have to negotiate with. This is what he says. I'm not going into the last chapter very much because there's lack of time. But the last chapter is, I believe, is very, very interesting, when he's talking about colonial war and mental disorders. And in this particular chapter, the colonial war and mental disorders, he's really talking about the Freudian discourses and the way in which colonization is in our minds and the way in which the things are there. So he's talking about the psychosomatic, the psychosomatic mental disorders, the psychosomatic tendencies of mental disorders which are there. Um, well, in fact, Frantz Fanon is saying that there are so many, symptoms, psychosomatic symptoms, which kind of talk about depression, which kind of represent depression, like stomach ulcers, pains which are felt dominantly in the night, vomiting, loss of weight, sadness, moroseness, irritability, these, nephritic colitis, menstruation trouble in women, immense sleeplessness, hair turning white. These are all the psychosomatic symbols of depression, which are often produced by colonialism, In fact, he talks about a certain experience where he says, and I'm just reading out that portion, it is not only necessary to fight for the liberty of your people, you must also teach the people once again and first learn once again yourself what is the full stature of a man, and this you must do for as long as the fight lasts. You must not go back into history, that history of men damned by other men, and you must bring out about the render possible the meaning of your people and other men. So, he's actually talking about the soldiers. Very interestingly, he's talking about the soldiers who are engaged in a kind of in a kind of a civil war. We know about the Biafran War, right, in Nigeria, which was about dividing Nigeria. So these civil wars require military action. Now these military people who are fighting against their own people, their own race, are actually developing all these symbols of mental disorders, because they are having to grapple with this mental violence of inflicting violence upon their own people. So what the argument of Fanon is that there are these mental disorders which are produced in us because we are producing violence in the same way the colonizers used to produce violence on the colonized. Now, in the post-colonial society, people who are inflicting violence and people who are subjected to violence, both are actually, they are both are, both are, I kind of, both are receiving, as it were, depression, right? Both are having to grapple with the mental disorder of depression because they are inflicting and, of course, subjecting themselves to violence. So these are the little points that that Fanon is talking about. So let me sort of now try and go into the last portion of my talk, which is about a kind of a roundup of what we were basically talking about. So well, so so African post-colonialism, therefore, is a very unique experience, as we can understand, because it is talking about um, its own experiences of having to negotiate with colonialism. So This is an interesting quote by Ama Ata Aidu. Ama Ata Aidu, as you know, is an interesting, is a very important writer. AMA, then ATA, then AIDO, Ama Ata Aidu. Ama Ata Aidu writes that perhaps the concept of post-colonialism was relevant to the United States after its War of Independence, and to a certain extent to the erstwhile imperial dominance of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Applied to Africa, India, and some other parts of the world, post-colonial is not only a fiction but most pernicious fiction, a cover-up of a dangerous period in a people's lives. Ama Ata Aidu is arguing that post-colonialism as an ideology is a sham. It is a fiction, simply because the post-colonialism as a period, as an ideology, does not even exist. Ama Ata Aidu. So Ama Ata Aidu is saying that post-colonialism is something which is something which is not even existent in the African experience, because post-colonialism is not even there in the African society. Because Ama Ata Aidu's contention is that Africa is still deeply neo-colonial. That is, the political bourgeois, the capitalist bourgeois, they still continue to have this structure in place where the labor and the women are subjected to violence, are subjected to a lot of oppression. So therefore, it's simply not something which is worth discussing. This is what Amata did. Of course, she has a very radical point of post-colonialism, as you can understand. On the other hand, there are some people like there's another uh, critic called Olaniyan Tejumola. Okay, Olaniyan, Niyyan, Olaniyan Tejumola, Tejumola. He's a Nigerian literary scholar. Now, Olaniyan Tejumola has a wonderful essay called "Postmodernity, Post-Coloniality, and African Studies." Okay, the essay is called "Postmodernity, Post-Coloniality, and African Studies." Now, people like Tejumola. Um, now, they are of the point of view that postmodernism and the post-colonial should not be interchangeably used. There is a lot of critics who feel that post-colonialism emerges out of postmodernism, but then people like Tejumula and people like Chinua Achebe are of the point of view that postmodernism is more of a Eurocentric ideology. It comes as a reaction and as a continuation to modernism. But Tejumula says that post-colonialism is more ideologically inclined towards the colonial societies or towards the post-colonial societies. So post-colonialism is basically an ideological standpoint talking about the negotiation of the post-colonial thinkers and people with their erstwhile history of colonialism, right? They're negotiating with their past. The post-colonial writers are negotiating with the past. They're negotiating with the past. They're negotiating with their own colonial experiences. They're negotiating with their own colonial history. And so therefore postmodernism is something which should not be interchangeably used with post-colonialism. Well, the essay of Tejumula is called "Postmodernity, Post-Coloniality, and African Studies." Well, so these are the debates that I'm talking about. Uh, well, of course, who can ever disregard a book that is considered to be a foundational text of post-colonialism, Edward Said's Orientalism, right? And we all know that in the Orientalism, Edward Said's argument is that the Orient is the Occident is producing the identity of the Orient. So therefore the Orient is a production of the Occidental gaze. It is the West which is producing the identity of the East, um, through its gaze, through its power. So therefore, the very production of identity becomes a statement of power, a statement of colonial power. And this is something, of course, which Edward Said is saying. We all know that. So Edward Said's contention is very, very important, right? And the way in which the Orient is getting produced as a symbol, as a construct through the gaze of Europe, through the gaze of the West. So the West becomes the progenitor of the East. So that is something which Edward Said is, of course, resisting. He's saying that this centering of Europe and this production of the Orient through the Occident will have to be resisted if the East wants to be out of that stereotype as produced by the West. In fact, in the modern theories, we often use terms like the global South and the global North. And the global South well, they represent, the global South represents a kind of a geopolitical space, which are basically the erstwhile colonies of Europe, right? So we talk about the global South because we do not like to use terms like the developing world and the underdeveloped nations because they are deeply prejudiced and extremely stereotyped. So therefore, in order to substitute those terms, well, we use terms like the global South, which is a geopolitical term, talking about the erstwhile colonies of Europe. Simon Gikandi, very interesting, an author. Simon Gikandi, Simon, then Gikandi. Simon Gikandi. Simon Gikandi writes an essay called Theory, Literature, and Moral Considerations. Theory, Literature, and Moral Considerations. Gikandi, by the way, has also books on novels of Africa, as also a book which studies critically the novels of Chinua Achebe. Okay, so both those books are very interesting. Now, Simon Gikandi, who is a Kenyan literary scholar, he says that there has to be a kind of a difference between the Eurocentric discourse and the Afrocentric discourse. He says that the valorization of difference in post-colonial theory, the vilification of African difference in European discourse, Eurocentric discourse, and the violence of colonial inventions of ethnic difference in post-colonial Africa. Gikandi argues that African fiction is largely preoccupied with moral considerations, the moral narrative of human freedom, and the question of what it means to be African in the modern world. So, most of these post-colonial authors from Africa have a very important moral question in their discourse. And that moral question is centering around the position of Africa vis-a-vis the rest of the world in the post-colonial era. So what is the position of Africa now? Is Africa liberated? Is Africa completely out of the stereotype? Is Africa completely out of the structural violence that Frantz Fanon is talking about? The answers are no. So therefore, the moral question that the African writers will have to negotiate is what is the condition of Africa now in the neo-colonial world, in the world of in the world of American capitalism and American monopolism. What is the position of Africa? What about the African people? What about the experiences of the African diaspora? The African diaspora, even today, are subjected to racial violence. We saw that how George Floyd, was killed, right? And the whole of American continent had to rise in revolt, especially the black population of America. They had to rise in revolt against this structural and systemic violence, which is still there in the American political space. So therefore, this is deeply problematic. So therefore, the moral question that the African writers are negotiating with is, what is the condition of the Africans now, right? Well, So so this is, so the thing is that so Gikandi is arguing that what the post-colonial experience is, it is a kind of a space clearing gesture, right? So a post-colonial experience is a kind of a space clearing gesture. So we are trying to, Gikandi, yes, Gikandi, Gikandi. Now Gikandi, of course, is now arguing that post-colonial experience is a kind of a space clearing gesture. That is, we are trying to declutter our mind from all those images of stereotypifications which the European colonizers had given to us. So therefore, this is all about decolonization of the mind. This is the space clearing. We are clearing out the spaces of oppression. We are clearing out the spaces of colonial stereotypification. So that is something which is very important. And in fact, he's very interesting. I really love this. Gikandi is saying that the post-colonial authors must resist the mistranslation of Africa. Okay, they have to stop the mistranslation of Africa. We cannot simply continue to mistranslate Africa. We cannot simply continue to represent Africa as the black continent. That mistranslation must stop, right? So the authors, the theoreticians, they should, of course, uh, simply resist that. Gikandi, and there is another author. And the author is called Kwame Anthony Appiah. Kwame, Kwame, Kwame Anthony Appiah, Appiah. He has a very interesting essay. Appiah has a very interesting essay. Kwame Anthony Appiah writes an essay called "Is the Post in Post-Colonial the Post in Postmodern?" Very interesting essay. He writes, the title of the essay is the Post in Post-Colonial the Post in Postmodern? Now here Appiah argues that, this is what he argues. So let me quote him. Appiah says, uh, you know, so the African novels are novels of delegitimation, rejecting the Western imperium. It is true, but also rejecting the nationalist project of the post-colonial national bourgeois. And so it seems to me the basis for that project of delegitimation is very much not the postmodernist one, rather, it is grounded in an appeal to an ethical universe. Indeed, it is best as intellectual responses to oppression in Africa largely are based in an appeal to a certain simple respect for human suffering, a fundamental revolt against the endless misery of the last 30 years. So therefore, you see, most of these post-colonial authors are not only talking about decolonizing the process of African stereotypification as produced by the colonizers, but they're also reacting and resisting the oppressions instituted by the national bourgeois, right? And they believe that the national bourgeois are kind of dealing with, they're basically dealing with, oppressing the common people, the politicians, the bourgeois, the crony capitalists. They are all, instituting. They're all instituting a system by which by which the common people are subjected to an oppression, and this is the national bourgeois, the national system of oppression, as it were, if I may say, that has to be resisted. So herein I sort of intend to end my talk because it's been almost an hour that I have been speaking on. I will be ending um, with a certain poem. I'll be ending with a certain poem by Chinua Achebe, because poems are lovely to end with, right? Not well, poems are lovely to be there with us forever, right? But I think it's a good note to end with. So this is a poem by Chinua Achebe called Agostinho Nito. Nito, were you no more than the middle one favored by fortune in children's riddle? Kwame, striding ahead to accost demons, behind you a laggard third, as yet unnamed, of twisted fingers. No, your secure strides were hard earned. Your feet learned their fierce balance in violent slopes of humiliation. Your delicate hands, patiently groomed for finest incisions, were commanded brusquely to kill your melodious voice to battle cry. Perhaps your family and friends knew a merry flash cracking the gloom. We see in pictures, but I prefer and will keep the darker legend. For I have seen how half a millennium of alien rape and murder can stamp a smile on the vacant face of the fool. The sinister grin of Africa's idiot kings who oversee in obscene palaces of gold the butchery of their own people. Nito, I sing your passing. I, timid requisitioner of your vast armory's most congenial supply, what shall I sing? A dirge answering the gloom? No, I will sing tearful songs of joy. I will celebrate the man who rode a trinity of awesome fates to the cause of our trampled race. Thou healer, soldier, and poet. Thank you so much. So I open the house for questions.
Thank you, sir, very much for this heavily informative and entertaining lecture, during which we indeed learned a great deal regarding African literature and African post-colonial thinkers. Well, we have a lot of questions indeed. I
Yeah.
don't know how much time you can spare for us.
Yeah.
We would love to.
So Nishogo, can we do in this way? So ask, I guess, three questions. Not more than, because I'm sure most of the people would now like to leave. So three questions. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will go through three of the questions.
Yeah.
First of all, Rahena Parveen is asking,
Hmm.
in order to renounce the lingering colonial ties, one must build an authentic African literature
Hmm.
and use their own language rather than European.
Hmm.
So, sir, do you think this was the reason why Ngũgĩ Thiong'o changed his name, and I mean his medium of
Hmm.
language
Hmm.
from English to Ngikuku,
Yes.
his native
Absolutely.
language?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll be very brief on that. Indeed, so this is the contention with language that Ngugi wa Thiong'o is constantly grappling with, right? Whether to write in English or whether to write in the native language. So therefore, one way of looking at it is this way, that let us appropriate English in such a manner that it captures the unique experience of African identity. And the other way of looking at it is that no, it is not good enough. So therefore, let me go into my native language. So yes, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, I believe, changed to GQU at the end of his career because he wanted to sort of capture, or I would say he wanted to sort of make an ideological statement that he is with his own people, that he is with his own native land. So this is indeed a political and an ideological stance that he makes in order to sort of reinstate his African identity. Yeah. So thank you, Rihanna, for your question. Yes.
Okay, the second question is from Prithu.
Okay.
He's asking, there are many conventions depicted in Things Fall Apart
Hmm.
that can be considered as an antithesis to our idea of progress.
Hmm.
For instance, the character of Okonkwo can be considered a product of a patriarchal society.
Hmm.
It's a paradox that feminists like Adichie loves Achebe's writing so much.
Hmm.
It's also curious that her book, The Purple Hibiscus,
Hmm.
also features an abusive father.
Hmm.
Does the African traditional values promoted promote such ideas which are counterintuitive? How a post-colonial scholar will tackle with ideas as such?
Hmm. So, Prithu, which society is perfect, right? So therefore, as Chinua Achebe had rightly said, that our past is not a technicolor idyll. So therefore, each Achebe is simply not interested to portray a picture of an ideal past. He's not a nationalist, if I may say in that way. He's not a nationalist. He's not somebody who, like the nationalists of our country, want to portray that everything, related to a certain majority community was good. It's not that. So therefore, Achebe is, as I mentioned in my talk, Achebe is exploring and exposing and questioning and critiquing and representing the inherent structures of violence which are there already in the Igbo society. So Okonkwo is indeed a product of patriarchal society. Absolutely, there's no doubt about that. In fact, he is deeply conditioned by the question of masochism, by the question of masculinity, as produced by the Igbo society. So therefore, he has to sacrifice Ikemefuna because he believes that if he does not sacrifice Ikemefuna, then he will become quote unquote feminine, and being feminine will simply marginalize him and ostracize him, and he will no longer be the leader of his tribe. So yes, so if you're saying that Okonkwo was patriarchal, of course he was, and Achebe is not stopping you from calling him deeply patriarchal and somebody who is basically driven by the ideologies of masculinity. Of course he was, and Achebe is trying exactly to do that. He's trying to represent those areas of violence which are already there in the pre-colonial society, then again negotiating that with the violence of colonialism. So yes, Achebe would always say that our past is not a technical riddle. So that I believe makes Achebe a very, very nuanced writer, a very pragmatic and a very I would say very matured writer. Yes.
Okay. If you may, we have two more questions
Yeah.
that are
Okay.
I
Okay.
really
Yeah.
like to ask you.
Yeah.
Firstly, Amrit is asking, there is a rising debate about going back to languages like Sanskrit in India,
Hmm.
dubbing it as decolonizing language and knowledge.
Mhm.
And don't you think such a desire for recovering a language is not a post-colonial act, especially in a global world?
This requires a lot of things, but I would be very brief over here. Um, First of all, Sanskrit is a language which is not dead in India. There are some people who still talk and produce art and politics in Sanskrit. There are villages who still continue to talk in Sanskrit. But I would say that there is nothing wrong in reinstating the past, in the sense that if you want to become a literary archaeologist, if you want to sort of dig out those languages and arts from the past and use it in a modern way, please go ahead and do it. But the problem really is when you are imposing that onto the others. Sanskrit is associated with a kind of a majoritarian politics that we see today, the rise of the majoritarian politics in India. And so therefore the rightists, the majoritarians, would believe that Sanskrit is deeply engaged with a certain majoritarian identity. The imposition of that is something which is deeply problematic. Right now, we do understand that on the other hand, the other side of the story is also this, that English, is something which is used globally. I think that was a part of the question as well, about this global world and how we use English. But there are some countries who do not use English at all, and they are doing fantastically well in every possible spheres. China, for example, some of the continental Europe, they do not use English, and they're doing wonderfully well in science, in education, in literature, in the arts. No problems with that. I think the whole question of English as a global language is of course due to the fact that that England had the highest footprint in terms of its colonial mission, right? The other Europeans did not have this expanse of their empire. So most of the Africans know English, most of the Indians, or not most, but many of the Indians would know English. And therefore, that is the case. And in fact, of course, after the 1950s, you have the rise of America, and America speaks English. So therefore, English now has become a tool of professional and economic development. And this is done because we entered into economic relations with each other on the basis of the English language, right? There are so many sectors, the IT sectors and stuff like that, which sort of deal in English. So yes, I mean, I would say that in a global world, it is not problematic to dig out the languages from the past. But if you are imposing that as a sort of identity, that is a problem. It is equally problematic, of course, if you are imposing English as a tool, or as a as a let's say, if you're using English as a language to define identity, to define culture. So if you speak English, you are wonderful. If you can't speak English, you're terrible. That kind of a binary is tremendously problematic, as we can understand. So yes, so it's very nuanced. It's very nuanced. It's like it kind of work both ways. But for me, everything works till you are not imposing it. Till it is done on the basis of consensus, it's fine. But if you're imposing it, then of course it becomes a problem.
Okay, I hope Amrit's question was answered. That
Yes.
was indeed a uh, very nuanced answer to the question. The next question is by Ananya Chatterjee,
Mhm.
my wife.
Oh
How is
wow.
African
Uh, yeah.
post-colonialism different from other forms of post-colonialisms? Are there any other differences than the distinction in their respective unique national identities?
Well, thank you for the question. Well, you see, I would say that it's basically the local experience, that really defines the uniqueness of a post-colonial experience, and nothing more than that. Because you see, post-colonialism as a tendency, post-colonialism as an ideology, is something that is moving, or that seeks to move from the global to the local. If the European humanism is moving from the local to the global, then post-colonialism is moving from the global to the local, because it is the local experience that post-colonial writers and thinkers are basically trying to um, they're trying to capture. So therefore, yes, I think the point of the matter is that the African experience, the African post-colonial experience, is unique in the sense that it is very, it talks about its own experience. But let me also sort of pose a pointer over here, and this is something which is very important. The term African post-colonialism itself is problematic, because you can, as students of literature, you can ask the question, what is African post-colonialism? Because is there anything called African post-colonialism? Because Africa is a continent of diverse languages, diverse cultures, diverse races, and diverse histories. In fact, the seminar that Chinua Achebe and Ngũgĩ was referring to, them, the Makerere seminar, there, people were basically grappling with this question as to what is this African experience? Is Egypt in Africa, right? Then what about the various races? Africa has thousands of languages. It's the same as if a European comes to you and says that let me have an Indian dish. Now, if the guest comes to Nishargo's house, and Nishargo then will have to grapple with the question, what is an Indian dish? Because there's nothing called an Indian dish. There has to be a kind of a Bengali dish, or a Punjabi dish, or a Tamil dish, or a Meghalayan dish. But what is an Indian dish? It's very difficult to define. In fact, there is nothing called an Indian dish. So I believe that African post-colonialism itself is an oxymoron. I title my talk as African post-colonialism, but I believe that African post-colonialism itself is an oxymoron, because there is nothing called African, because there are so many different languages. In fact, in Nigeria itself, where you have the location of Chinua Achebe, in Nigeria itself, there are almost 200 different languages. 200 in one single countries, 190 plus different languages, right? So you can understand that, and by the way, African culture is a very oral culture. They prize orality over written literature. So therefore, there are so many different languages and so many different cultures. So therefore, the very fact that there are so many local experiences make African post-colonialism a unique experience in itself, because every local experience is a unique tale of post-colonialism. So therefore, in that way, they're different in themselves, and then they're different to the others, right? So this is something which is very interesting. Yes.
Thank you, sir, for that answer.
Yeah.
Thank you for answering all of our queries. If
Thank
you
you.
may, I would like to take one last question because it's
Yes.
quite uh, early on asked by Sriporna Banerjee.
Yeah.
Is post-colonialism a compulsive fictionalized representation
Hmm.
of psychological disfigurement to give way to the productive form of cross-cultural intellectual activity?
Mm. Lots of heavy terms over there, Triparna. I hope get I hope that I've got the question right. But no, it's. Can I just repeat that, because there are so many
Yeah,
terms over there? Nishargo, just
yeah.
repeat that once again.
I'll repeat the question.
Yeah.
Is postcolonialism a
Yeah.
compulsive fictionalized representation
Okay.
of psychological disfigurement
Okay.
to give way to the productive form of cross-cultural intellectual activity?
The thing is that post-colonialism is really not about cross-cultural dialogues. The cross-cultural dialogue comes in the diaspora studies, which is of course an offshoot of post-colonialism. It requires a different session altogether, the diaspora studies, and how the in-between experience that Homi Bhabha is talking about is represented. But post-colonialism it's really not about cross-cultural dialogue as much as it is about the representation of the unique experience of the particular localized condition. But you're talking about this compulsive fictionalized representation. I don't know. I mean, I really do not get the meaning of the word compulsive. It's not compulsive, but I think that what you're basically referring to is the fact that the post-colonial authors are basically feeling the necessity to write back. What Bill Ashcroft is writing in his book, Bill Ashcroft and Russell Tiffin, right? The Empire Writes Back. And in that book, of course, they're talking about writing back at the empire. That is, you're basically using the tool of the empire to resist that very empire. Like in Amir Khan's film Lagan, for example, they're playing cricket to resist the British. So basically, you are taking the tool of the British and then you are writing back at the British using their tool. So I think it is compulsive, compulsive in the sense that yes, they are feeling the necessity perhaps to write back at the end, but they have to. All right, we have to, because we have our own history, we have our own identity, we have our own stories to talk about, right? We have our own stories to talk about. So therefore, we have to write back. So therefore, it is not fiction. Yes, well, the fictional authors are writing in a fictionalized way. The writers of history are writing from a historical point of view. The political writers, the political science writers are writing from a deeply political point of view. Of course, these are there. So therefore, yes, in a fictional way, perhaps we are all writing back. We are all writing back to sort of assert our identity and to rescue our identity from the stereotypifications of our colonial experience. Yes. I think somebody was talking about Nisharga. Somebody was talking about negritude or something like that. If you,
Yes, one question was there regarding
hmm.
how neocolonialism is then currently being in opposition to negritude.
Yeah, thank you. It's a lovely question. I think it's not in opposition to negritude at all, but it is a continuation of negritude. Negritude as a movement was started, I think, by Senghor, 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 Leopold Senghor, and the other politicians from Africa, because they were basically starting with the ideology that black is beautiful, right? Something which is also represented, if you remember, in the Harlem Renaissance as well, in America, where they are basically trying to assert the black rights in America. So it is a continuation of negritude, actually. And I would say that the problem is what the Floyd experience has taught us, that we are still deeply, deeply racial. And look at your own experience. We have been talking about the European African binary, but I always tell to my students, think about the Indian African binary. Are the Indians very respectful of the Africans? I don't think so. I don't think so, because like if the Indian African binary is such that we still kind of think the Africans to be black and uncivilized and stuff like that. So therefore, yes, I mean, and even if you look at the papers today, you will see that people are still wanting fair brides, and the companies sell these fairness creams. So this desire to be fair is deeply problematic, because you're basically hierarchizing the fair over the black. So therefore, we are deeply colonial, and we are deeply racial even now. And I don't know, when will this end? Hopefully, we all will be decolonizing our mind very soon. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that extremely informative lecture and the many engaging answers that you provided that absolutely addressed the questions. I'm sorry that we cannot cover all of the questions given both here in Zoom and also by some in the YouTube link. And I am hopeful that people will get in touch with us and share their opinions regarding this lecture, their response, their appreciation of this lecture. Already we're seeing appreciations by people on the chat box. And lastly, I would request people who are uh, asking for the names of the chapters and the essays and the books to go through the chat box and take down the names, because once the lecture is closed, the chat box will go away. So anyway, thank you very much, sir. And Payal, over to you then.
Thanks a lot, sir. It was an enlightening session, as many of them have already told. A few of them have also said that this is the best session that
Oh,
we have
I'm
organized.
humbled. I'm really humbled. Thank you so much.
So we really feel that it was really insightful, and thank you for putting things which was so complex in with so much of clarity. So thank you. And if you will, I would just like to share this representation of the Black people, the Africans that you were talking about in Tintin in Congo. So,
Oh, that will be wonderful. Yeah, please do that.
can you see the screen?
Yes, 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 we
So
can.
this is the representation which
Exactly. And look
was
at the
talking.
way in which the Africans are dehumanized, completely dehumanized to the level of being apes.
And I think it would also be an interesting lecture if you like we could go into what it means to be human and non-human someday,
Right.
and how being usually animal motives are used to dehumanize uh, again the victims or the marginalized groups. So we would be looking forward to more sessions from your side, and we are really thankful that you joined us and you gave us so much information, and we really feel blessed. Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
So I think we can end the session,
Yeah.
and we hope that we'll meet sir again.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
thank you, sir. The idea of cultural representation in graphic novels as such is a very interesting idea that you sort of brought up. Thank you very much, sir. And
Thank you.
uh,
Thank you.
I think we can close the session